Mark Ciampach, the author of Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. In this lecture video, we will talk about Chapter 10, Authentication and Account Management. Every day we electronically authenticate ourselves by proving who we are. On our computer, we enter a password, which is a form of authentication credentialing. There are other forms as well, such as tokens and biometrics. And managing the different credentials using account management is an important part of security as well. In this chapter, we will study authentication and account management. Remember, stay secure.
Chapter 10, Authentication and Account Management. Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. This is a list of the objectives for this chapter. We want to describe the 3 types of authentication credentials. Explain what single sign-on can do. List the account management procedures for securing passwords. And define trusted operating systems. We'll begin by talking about authentication credentials. Consider this scenario. Joshua stops at the health club in the afternoon to exercise. Now, after he locks his car, he walks into the club and he's recognized by Lee, the clerk at the desk. Lee chats with Joshua and then allows him to pass on to the locker room. Once inside, Joshua opens his locker's combination lock with a series of numbers that he's memorized. Sounds very simple. But Joshua here has actually used 3 types of authentication credentials. First, by locking the doors of his car, its contents are protected based on what he has, which is the wireless key fob, that button that you click in order to lock the car doors. Because Joshua possesses that key fob, he can lock the doors and secure his contents. Now, next, his access to the locker room is protected by what Joshua is. Lee had to recognize Joshua's unique characteristics, hair color, face, body type, voice, etc., before he could enter the locker room. These characteristics make Josh who he is, and they were used to authenticate him as the genuine Josh. Now finally, the contents of Joshua's locker are protected by what he knows, namely his lock combination. So what we have here is we have authentication credentials based on what Joshua has, what he is, his characteristics, and what he knows, the lock combination. Despite the fact that there are several different authentication credentials that can be used in information technology in order to verify the genuineness of the users, each of these can be classified into one of these 3 broad categories. Authentication, that is, a user presenting himself to the computer and proving that he is the genuine person to whom he claims to be. Authentication can be based on what a user knows, like a password, what a user possesses or has, like a token or a card, or what a user is, biometrics. We'll start with the most common, that is, passwords. In most systems, a user logs in by identifying herself. This is done by entering a username, but of course, because anybody could enter the username, the next step is for the user to authenticate herself by proving she actually is who she claims to be, and this is most frequently done by providing information that only the user would know, namely a password. By definition, a password is just a secret combination of letters, numbers, characters that only the user should know. And passwords, of course, are the most common type of authentication today. We use them all the time. We have many of them. Yet despite their widespread use, passwords provide only weak protection. There are several different types of attacks that can be launched against passwords, and there are actions that should be taken in order to strengthen passwords. What are the weaknesses of passwords? The weaknesses of passwords obviously center on human memory. Human beings can only memorize a limited number of items, and passwords can place a heavy load on human memory in 2 different ways. First, very long and complex passwords, and these of course are the most efficient type, long and complex. These can be difficult to memorize. and they can strain our ability to accurately recall them. Most users have difficulty remembering these types of strong passwords. Secondly, users today have to remember multiple passwords for many different accounts. Think for a moment of all of the passwords that you use today. Now, if you repeat passwords, that's not a good practice. That is, use the same password for multiple accounts. But most of us have accounts for different systems at work, at school, at home. We sometimes have multiple email accounts, may have online banking, may have internet site accounts, etc., etc. And each account, again, ideally should have its own unique password. In a recent study, 28% of a group of users had over 13 passwords each, while in another study of 144 users, they averaged 16 passwords per user. And actually, those numbers might actually be a little bit low. But the problem with passwords is even exacerbated because of security policies that force all passwords to expire after a set period of time, maybe 60 days. And then a new one has to be created. And some of these policies even prevent a previously used password from being recycled and used again. So the users have to repeatedly memorize new, long, complex passwords. So what do we do? Well, many users then will take shortcuts in order to relieve the burden on their memory. The first shortcut is to use a weak password, and this might be simply a common word like January or something like ABCDEF, or personal information like the name of a child or a pet. Those are easy to remember, but those are weak passwords. Now the second shortcut, again, as we've mentioned, is to reuse the same password for multiple accounts. Makes it easier for the user, but it also makes it easier for the attacker. If the attacker compromises one account, then he could use that knowledge of the password to attack other accounts that the user has, knowing that there's a very high probability that that password is repeated on these other accounts. I like the quotation by one security expert regarding passwords. He says, "The problem is the average user can't and won't even try to remember complex enough passwords to prevent attacks. As bad as passwords are, users will go out of their way to make the problem worse. If you ask them to choose a password, they'll choose a lousy one. If you force them to choose a good one, they'll write it on a post-it note and change it back to the password they changed it from the last month. And they'll choose the same password for multiple applications." This is probably a very accurate description of our use of passwords today. Now there are a variety of attacks that can be used against passwords. One is simply social engineering. It's possible that a password could be revealed through phishing, through shoulder surfing, through dumpster diving. Another attack on passwords is capturing. There are several methods that can be used to capture someone's password. We talked about keyloggers previously. A keylogger on a computer can capture all of the keystrokes that someone makes, and thus a keylogger could capture the passwords that are being entered on the keyboard. While passwords are in transit, a man-in-the-middle attack or a replay attack could be used. And a protocol analyzer could capture transmissions that contain passwords. Another attack is resetting. If an attacker can gain physical access to the user's computer, then they could erase the existing password and reset it to a new one. Password reset programs are freely available. All the user has to do is reboot from a CD or USB flash drive that contains a version of a different operating system with that password reset program. For example, to reset a password on a Microsoft Windows computer, a USB flash drive with Linux and the password reset program could be used. Now, of course, the disadvantage is whenever the user approaches the computer, that is the owner, it's immediately obvious that the password has been compromised because their password no longer works. Online guessing. Although it is possible for an attacker to enter different passwords at the login prompt to try to guess the password, in reality, that's not practical. An 8-character password that uses 76 characters of upper and lowercase symbols digits and numbers, the possible number of passwords that would have to be generated is just beyond what could conceivably be done. So in addition, most accounts can be set to disable all logins after, let's say, 5 incorrect attempts, something like this. So practically speaking, online guessing would not be used. But what is used very frequently is offline cracking. So due to the limitations of online guessing, most password attacks use this offline cracking approach. Now, passwords are usually stored in an encrypted form on the computer. When a user enters their password to log on, what they enter on the computer is then encrypted in the same way as when they created their initial password, and then the two are compared. That is, the user logs on, that password is encrypted, and it is compared with the stored encrypted version. If a match occurs, user's approved. Now, what attackers will do is they will try to steal the file of the encrypted passwords and load that file into their own computer. They then can attempt to discover the passwords by, let's say, comparing the encrypted passwords with encrypted passwords of their own they have created. Once they have a match of encrypted passwords, they know what the password is. There actually are several different types of offline cracking techniques. One is the automated brute force attack. In this type of attack, every possible combination of letters, numbers, and characters is used to create encrypted passwords that are then matched with those in the stolen file. This could be a slow approach, but yet it's the most thorough. Using an automated brute force attack program, the attacker enters parameters for the types of passwords that they want to be generated. These parameters are password length. Using this brute force attack program, the attacker can say, I'm going to set a range of maximum and minimum length of passwords to be generated, such as 1 to 12 or something like this. The character set, that is the letters, symbols, and characters that make up the password. Because not all systems accept the same character set, if I can reduce the characters that I am having to filter through in creating these passwords from the attacker's standpoint, it will increase speed. I can select the language. I can select a pattern as well. Now, if any part of the password is known, a pattern could be entered to reduce the number of passwords that are generated. We can use such things as wildcards, question marks, and asterisks can replace multiple symbols. And skips. Because most passwords are word-like combinations, some brute force attack programs can be set up to skip nonsensical combination of characters, so that only passwords that are actually word-like combinations are actually created. Now, another type of offline cracking password attack is a dictionary attack. Whereas a brute force tries to create all possible combinations, a dictionary attack starts with the attacker creating encrypted versions of a common dictionary word, and then it compares those with the ones in the stolen password file. If there is an successful match, then the attacker has discovered what the password is. In this figure, we have an example of a dictionary attack where just a list of dictionary words are encrypted by the attacker, and then they compare those against a stolen password file. Once they have a match, they know exactly what the dictionary word is that serves as the user's password. There's a slight variation in this attack called a hybrid attack. The attack will slightly alter dictionary words by adding numbers to the end of the password, maybe spelling the words backwards, maybe slightly misspelling words, maybe including something like a special character, a $, an exclamation point, a pound sign, something like this. Many times users think that they're making their passwords more secure by taking a dictionary word and adding perhaps a number at the end or a special character or something like this, and they're fooling the attacker. Not the case at all. Those sort of passwords, dictionary words with just an ampersand or an asterisk added, are very weak. Now, brute force and dictionary attacks were once the primary tools of attackers, but more often today, attackers prefer something called rainbow tables. Rainbow tables make password attacks easier by creating a large pre-generated data set of encrypted passwords. There are two basic steps for using rainbow tables. The first is creating the table itself. Then the table is used to crack the password. A rainbow table is a compressed representation of a plain text passwords, and these are related and organized in a sequence called a chain. The attacker then is using that table to crack the passwords. Although rainbow tables are somewhat difficult to understand because of all that goes on behind the scenes, suffice it to say that a rainbow table is just a pre-generated list of passwords that the attacker can throw at the encrypted list in order to try to create the match. Generating a rainbow table requires a significant amount of time. However, once it is created, it does have significant advantages over other password attack methods. That table can be used repeatedly for attacks on other passwords. They're much faster than dictionary attacks, and the amount of memory needed on the attack machine is greatly reduced. Well, we've seen the type of attacks that can be launched against passwords. What about password defenses? If passwords are one of the primary means for authenticating ourselves, how can we make our passwords stronger? We want to create strong passwords. That's basically step one. But then we probably want to manage those passwords. That's basically step two. Let's talk about creating strong passwords. One insight into creating strong passwords is to examine how password attack programs attempt to break a password. And looking at password attack programs, most password attack programs view a password as consisting of two parts. It has a root, and then it has something attached to that root. It could be a prefix, stuff that comes before, or a suffix, stuff that comes after. These attack programs will then first test a password against 1,000 of the most common passwords. If it's not successful, it will combine common passwords with common suffixes. It will then use 5,000 common dictionary words, 10,000 names, 100,000 comprehensive dictionary words. It then will try lowercase, initial uppercase, all uppercase, final character uppercase, and make common substitutions for letters in dictionary words. For instance, many times users will substitute a $ for an S or the @ sign for an A. If I'm going to have a strong password, then there are just some general observations that I would want to consider in creating my password. Don't use a password that consists of dictionary words or any sort of phonetic words. Don't think that if you've taken a word and you've made some substitutions, that is, using a $ instead of an S, or if you tack on a couple of special characters at the end, like 12 or XZ or something like this, that you've made a strong password. You haven't. Also, don't use any sort of information that could be personally identifiable to you. A birthday, family member name, pet name, something like that. Don't repeat characters or use sequences like ABC 123. Don't use short passwords. Although a simple 6-character lowercase password has over 308 million combinations, a modern desktop computer can generate 1 million passwords per second. A strong password should be a minimum of 12 characters in length. Now, creating passwords is one thing, strong passwords, But managing passwords is equally important. For an organization, one important defense against password cracking is to prevent the attacker from capturing the password file with the encrypted passwords. So there are some defenses against allowing the attacker to capture that password file. Such obvious things as don't leave a computer running unattended, really even if it's in a locked office. Screensaver should be set to resume only when a password is entered. Don't set a computer to boot from a CD-ROM or another device. This is because if that's the case, then someone could slip in a USB flash drive, turn the computer on, and it's going to boot from the flash drive, which may hold the password cracking program, allowing me to capture the encrypted list of passwords. You should password protect your ROM BIOS, and if necessary, physically lock the computer so it can't be opened. Now, some good password management techniques are: we should change our passwords frequently, shouldn't reuse old passwords, that is, repeat them on multiple accounts, don't write the password down, have a unique, different password for each account. If it's necessary for a user to access another user's account, then a temporary password should be set up and then immediately changed. Don't allow a computer to automatically sign into an account or record a password so that a login is not necessary. Don't enter passwords on public access computers or other individuals' computers. Don't enter a password while connected over an unencrypted wireless network. Now, one way to make passwords stronger is to use non-keyboard characters, or special characters that don't appear on the keyboard. Now, not all applications can accept these non-character keyboards, but many can. We can create non-printable, or non-keyboard characters rather, by holding down on a Windows machine the Alt key and simultaneously typing numbers on the numeric keypad. Here's an example of the character map of a Microsoft Windows computer. This lists all of the non-keyboard characters, and if I add these to my password, it provides a stronger degree of security. Now, because it's so burdensome to create a strong password for each account and then properly manage them, many times users will turn to different technology solutions to help them with their passwords. Web browsers today, like Firefox and Internet Explorer and others, often contain a feature that allows the user to save a password that has been entered while using that browser. These are called different names. In Internet Explorer, it's called the autocomplete password, or through a separate dialog box that maybe pops up. We can use a web browser in effect to help us manage our passwords. Now, autocomplete passwords are actually stored in the Microsoft Windows registry, and they're encrypted. But using the autocomplete feature has its disadvantages. That is, managing our passwords through a web browser has disadvantages. I'm restricted then to using the computer that has that password information that's stored there. The passwords could be vulnerable if another user were to allow another user access to that computer. So because of these disadvantages, generally speaking, these password supplements, part of the web browser that allows me to memorize passwords, it's not recommended that they be used. However, what is strongly recommended is to use something called a password management application. Someone called these the digital equivalent to a written post-it note, and that's probably a pretty good definition of them. These password management applications are programs that allow a user to create and then store multiple strong passwords in a single vault file. And that vault file is protected by one very strong master password. Users can retrieve their individual passwords as necessary by opening up the file, and then they can simply drag and drop into the username and password fields. The advantage of using a password management application is I only have to memorize one very strong password to get into the application in which all of my passwords are stored. And they're all strongly encrypted in this password management vault file. I can have various synchronization features set up. So there are all sorts of different advantages to using a password management application. These applications can be installed locally. I can have a portable application, internet storage as well. If I wish, I could actually have my vault file out there in the internet so I could access it from any computer if I didn't want to just carry on a flash drive that had the program on it. Now, that, of course, is a look at passwords, which is based on what I know. When we opened the chapter, we talked about authentication is based on what you know, what you have, what you are. Let's now move the discussion from authentication based on what I know, a password, to authentication based on what I have, what's in my possession uniquely that someone else does not have. And we'll begin by talking about tokens. A significant increase in the level of authentication credentials can be achieved by using what's called a token. A token is typically a small device, so small it can be affixed to the keychain that we carry around. This small device has a window display. Now, the token and a corresponding authentication server share a unique algorithm. Each user, of course, is going to have their own different algorithm, but each user and the corresponding authentication server know that algorithm. They share it. A token generates a code from the algorithm once every 30 to 60 seconds, and the code is only valid for a brief period of time. That is the time that is displayed on the token. Now, when a user logs in, she would enter her username along with the code, or maybe a variation of it, that is currently displayed on the token. Now, when the authentication server receives it, the server looks up the algorithm that's associated with the specific user. It then generates its own code and compares it with what was entered. If they're identical, the user then, obviously, is authenticated. So the user enters username and code from the token. The server looks up the algorithm that's associated with that user, generates its own code, compares. If we've got a match, the person is authenticated. So what we're doing is we're authenticating ourselves not just based on what we know, but we're authenticating ourselves based on what we possess and what no one else has, which is that token, and that token displays that code for us. Now, tokens have some advantages over passwords. Of course, a token code is going to change very frequently, once every 30 to 60 seconds. And even if the attacker were to see the code and write it down, the attacker would have just a very limited amount of time in which they then could enter that code, because as we said, it expires once a minute. Here are the steps of that process that we've talked about. The user looks up the code on the token, and then the user enters their username and password along with the code. The authentication server then creates a code and does the comparison. Now, sometimes with tokens, the number that's displayed is the password. More often, we actually combine what a person knows with what a person has, the token. That is to say, the person still has to enter a username, their password, and then their token. So we have multiple steps in authentication, but multiple levels. Continuing the advantages, A user may not know if a password has been stolen, but of course if the token is stolen, it's fairly obvious. And steps can be taken then to disable the account. Now, there are some variations in these token systems. As we said, some systems use a code displayed as a replacement for a password, while others actually require that a password along with the code be entered. A more secure system requires the user to create what's called a personal identification number, a PIN, that's actually then combined with the code to create a single passcode. For instance, if the person has the PIN 1694 and the code is 190411 that's displayed on the token, the user would enter 1694 190411 as the passcode. Because this uses both what a user knows as well as what a user has, it's called multi-factor authentication. Using just one type of authentication we commonly call single-factor authentication. We might just notice that because of the wide popularity today of cell phones, tokens are being replaced by cell phones. A code can be sent to the user's cell phone through an app or through a text message instead of having to carry around a cell phone and a token. Cards. There are several types of cards that can be used for authentication. Instead of carrying around a separate token, I would have a card in my possession. A smart card contains an integrated circuit chip that can hold information, can be used as part of the authentication process. Now, smart cards can be what are called contact cards, which have kind of like a pad that allows electronic access to the contents of the chip, or they can be contactless cards that don't require any sort of physical contact with the card itself. Here's an example of what a smart card would look like. Okay, we've talked about authentication based on what we know, passwords. We've talked about authentication based on what we have, tokens and cards. Let's now look at authentication based on what we are, what we call biometrics. There are different categories of biometrics. Standard biometrics uses a person's unique physical characteristics for authentication. Now, we could use fingerprints, we could use face, we could use hands, we could use the iris and the retina of the eye to authenticate a user, because all these are unique for each person. Fingerprint scanners have become the most common type of standard biometric device. Because our fingerprint consists of actually ridges and valleys, the ridges being the upper skin layer of the finger and the valley being the lower segments. So in one method of fingerprint scanning, the scanner locates a point where these ridges end and split and then converts them to a unique series of numbers and stores that information as a template. A second method actually creates a template from just selected locations on the finger. There are two basic types of fingerprint scanners. A static fingerprint scanner requires the user to place the entire thumb or finger on a small oval on the scanner, and the scanner takes an optical picture of the fingerprint and compares it with the fingerprint image on file. The other type of scanner is called a dynamic fingerprint scanner. In this, the user simply moves his finger across a small slit or opening. Here's the example of that dynamic fingerprint scanner. It'd be great if biometrics worked all the time and we could use them to replace passwords, but they have some disadvantages. The first one is cost. Biometric readers, these hardware scanning devices, would have to be installed at each location where authentication is required. Now, even though we commonly find standard biometric fingerprint scanners on higher end laptop computers for authentication, these are well known to not provide a strong degree of security. Why? Because these biometric readers are not always foolproof. They actually can reject authorized users and even accept unauthorized users. It's mainly due to the fact that facial and hand characteristics have to be scanned and compared. So many errors are kind of entered into the process. Plus, biometrics can be defeated in some ways. Well, if we can't use just standard biometrics to uniquely identify ourselves, are there other types of biometrics that can be used to uniquely identify us? And the answer is yes. A new type of biometrics known as behavioral biometrics is being developed. Instead of looking at my body characteristics, behavioral biometrics will authenticate based on normal actions that I perform, but these actions can be considered unique to me. Some of the most promising are keystroke dynamics, voice recognition, and computer footprinting. We'll start with keystroke dynamics. One type of behavioral biometrics attempts to recognize my unique typing rhythm. Now, all users type on the keyboard at a different pace. There was a study that was funded that concluded that keystroke dynamics of entering a username and a password could provide up to 98% accuracy. Now, keystroke dynamics uses two unique variables, dwell time and flight time. Dwell time is the amount of time it takes for a key to be pressed and released. Flight time is the amount of time between the keystrokes. So both down when the key is pressed and up when the key is released is measured. And we can create a template from how a user types. So when the user enters their username and password, it is sent along with the user's individual typing sample for authentication. Now, if both the password and the typing sample stored match those on the authentication server, then the user is approved. Now, one of the nice things about keystroke dynamics is it doesn't require special hardware, and the user doesn't have to take any additional steps beyond entering their username and password. With keystroke dynamics, the computer records my typing, that is the flight time and the dwell time, and it builds a template. And in this figure, that white area, user template, in the middle there, is my user template of typing, if you would. Now, when I'm asked to enter my username and password, I type it in, and it falls within the range of my standard user template, the way in which I normally type. An attacker, on the other hand, would not be able to replicate that, and thus their attempt to enter my username and password, even if they have the correct password, it would still fall in the unapproved area because they type differently than I do. Thus, the attacker would not be authenticated. A second type of behavioral biometrics, besides keystroke dynamics, is voice recognition. All of our voices are different, so voice recognition can be used to authenticate users based on the unique characteristics of a person's voice. And there are several different things that make our voice different. These, again, can be quantified. A voice template can be created, much like the template in keystroke dynamics. One thing to remember, though, is voice recognition is not to be confused with speech recognition. Speech recognition accepts spoken words for input as if they'd been typed on the keyboard. Voice recognition is somewhat different. Now, one concern regarding voice recognition is the attacker could record the user's voice and try to create a recording to use for authentication. It's something we commonly find happening in movies and television shows. That is, the individual actually has their voice unknowingly recorded, and the attacker then walks up to a closed door that's secured by a voice recognition system, and simply using a recorder plays it back and the door automatically opens. Yet in reality, this would be very difficult to do. The reason is we speak in phrases and sentences instead of isolated words. There's something called a phonetic cadence, or when we speak two words together, there's a way in which one word bleeds into the next word. So it'd be very hard to capture different words, several hours of someone's voice speaking different words, and parse it into separate words and then combine it together. Still talking about behavioral biometrics, computer footprinting is interesting. When and where a user normally accesses, let's say, his bank's website, if it is typically from his home computer at nights on weekends, this information can be used to establish a computer footprint of typical access. If the computer, however, is located in Russia and attempts to access the bank site at 2 a.m., this obviously may be an indication that it's an attacker trying to gain access. So the type of information that we can capture and footprint include a geographic location, time of day, internet service provider, basic PC configuration as well. So a footprint of my computer and how I normally use it then can be established, and that can be used to uniquely identify me. If all of a sudden a request comes in from a computer located in Russia at 2 a.m. and that's not normally how I access my online banking, then that would be denied. Now, whereas standard biometrics considers a person's physical characteristics, behavioral biometrics looks at the normal actions we perform. Cognitive biometrics is related to the perceptions and thought processes and understanding of the user. Again, that's uniquely me. Cognitive biometrics is considered to be much easier for users to remember because it's based on my life experiences, and that also makes it more difficult for an attacker to imitate. There are several different examples of cognitive biometrics authentication. One is requiring a user to identify specific faces. A user is provided a random set of photographs of different faces, maybe 3 to 7, which then serve as their password. They go through a familiarization process that's kind of designed to imprint the faces on the user's mind. Now, when the user logs in, they have to select their 3 faces from different groups, each group containing perhaps 9 faces. The groups are presented one at a time until all the faces have been correctly identified, and they're scrambled, if you would. They don't appear in the same sequence, making it difficult for an attacker to emulate that. So this type of cognitive biometrics about memorizing faces, instead of me typing something in, faces appear and I select those that I have memorized as being my faces for authentication. Another example of cognitive biometrics is based on life experiences that I remember. This process begins by the user selecting a memorable event in her lifetime. Maybe it was a vacation or a special achievement or a family dinner. Then the user is asked questions about that memorable event. Maybe what type of food was served, where it was located, who was in attendance, etc. And then the final question requires the user maybe to enter a specific item, something that was eaten at the dinner. Now, the next time the user logs in, after they enter the username and password, they're presented a screen that says, hey, remember that dinner? And maybe they're asked a series of questions about it. How old were you? Where was the dinner located? Who was in attendance? Something like that. And after successfully answering 2 or 3 of the questions, the user is authenticated. It's predicted that a key element of authentication in the future may be based more on the cognitive biometrics than on the other types of authentication that we've talked about. Single sign-on. One of the problems facing users today is, of course, they have multiple accounts across multiple platforms that ideally would each have a unique username and password. And as we've said, managing all those is very difficult, and users often revert to creating weak passwords to make it easier. What if a user had a single username and password to gain access to all accounts? So they really only have to have one item to remember. That's really the idea behind identity management, which is a single authentication credential that's shared across multiple networks. Now, when those networks are owned by different organizations, it's technically called federated identity management. Now, one application of federated identity management is what is known as single sign-on, SSO, using one authentication credential to access multiple accounts or applications. Now, SSO holds some real promise because it could reduce the number of usernames and passwords that have to be memorized. Potentially could be reduced down to one. There are some different implementations of web-based federated identity management systems. One product is a Microsoft Windows Live ID. This was introduced back in 1999 as part of the .NET Passport. It was then called Microsoft Passport Network, and then the name was changed to Windows Live ID. It was originally designed to be a single sign-on for web commerce. The authentication process would be that the user would enter a username and password. They would be given a time-limited global cookie that would be stored on the computer with an encrypted ID tag, and that tag is then sent to the website. The website uses that tag for identification, and it would then store encrypted, time-limited local cookies on the user's computer. Now, unfortunately, Windows Live ID was not widely supported as Microsoft anticipated, and it's currently being phased out. It's used for some identification on some Windows products, but Windows Live ID is not being widely used. Something that has much more traction is something called OpenID. Windows Live ID was proprietary and had centralized authentication. OpenID is not proprietary and has a decentralized approach. Doesn't require specific software to be installed on the desktop. OpenID is really a uniform resource locator, a URL-based identity system. In OpenID, only a URL is backed by a username and a password, and the OpenID provides a means to prove that the user owns that specific URL. In the authentication process, the user goes, let's say, to a website that provides OpenID accounts. There are several free ones out there, and the user is given an OpenID account such as me.myopenid.com, something like that. Now, when the user visits a website, when maybe they want to purchase something that requires them to sign in, they instead can use their OpenID. They simply enter the URL of their OpenID, me.myopenid.com. Now, the website then directs the person to the myopenid.com where they're required to enter their password to authenticate themselves and indicate that they trust the website with their identity. Now, the myopenid.com then sends them back to the website where they're trying to make the purchase, and the person is now authenticated. OpenID does have some security weaknesses. One is it depends on the URL identifier routing to the correct server, which depends on the domain name server, the DNS, which, as we've said before, has its own set of security weaknesses. In its current format, OpenID is really not strong enough for things like banking and e-commerce, but it may be considered suitable for other less secure sites. Open authorization, OAuth. An individual who maybe wants to post photos online of her latest vacation would start by logging in to her online storage account to upload her photos, And then she might have to access her photo sharing file to post her photos. Again, she has to log into this site with another username and password. Once the photos are posted, she might want to access her online contact list that's at another site, entering another username and password. Then she wants to go to her social media site to spread the word about her photos. What we have multiple sites with multiple usernames and multiple passwords. One technology to avoid all these multiple passwords is an open source service which is called Open Authentication. Open Authentication permits users to share resources stored on one site with a second site without having to forward their authentication credentials. It would also allow for different applications to more seamlessly share data across sites. Open Authentication relies on token credentials, and these credentials are for a specific resource for a limited period of time. Let's now move into a discussion of account management. Managing the passwords in user accounts can be accomplished by setting restrictions about the creation and the use of passwords. Now, these restrictions can be performed on a user-by-user basis, but that's pretty cumbersome. So mostly it's done in a more global setting. A preferred approach is to assign privileges by group. And the Microsoft Windows environment has two categories of group password settings. The first is called the password policy setting, and that's configured by the group policy at the domain level. And there actually are 6 common domain password policy settings. These password policy settings can be seen in this table. We have the ability to enforce password history, that is, determine the number of unique new passwords the user has to use before an old password can be used. The maximum password age, how many days a password can be used before the user is required to change it. Minimum password age, how many days a new password must be kept before the user can change it. This minimum password age is used so that users cannot change their password to something unique and then immediately change it back to an old password the next day or something like that. Minimum password length. Store passwords with complexity requirements. Account lockout duration. This determines the length of time a locked account remains unavailable before a user can try to log in again. Account lockout threshold. Number of attempts of failed login before a lockout occurs. And reset account lockout counter after how much time? Finally, let's talk about trusted operating systems. The security issues that surround authentication and account management really are a reflection of security issues of the operating systems themselves. Today's operating systems have roots that date back some 20 years or more, well before security was identified as being a critical process. So we have several flaws associated with operating systems. They're complex with millions of lines of code. They don't always isolate applications from each other. They lack a facility in order for the applications to authenticate themselves to each other. The operating systems can't create a trusted path between users and applications. A user can't know if the application they're using is legitimate, only one that may be impersonating an application. Trojan horse. Operating systems by default don't use the principle of least privilege. So one approach to combat this is to use something known as a trusted operating system, a trusted OS. This is a re-engineering of operating systems. They're designed to be secure from the ground up. A trusted OS can keep attackers from accessing and controlling critical parts of the operating system, also can prevent administrators from inadvertently making harmful changes. Now, vendors are developing trusted operating systems that are focusing on security, not only for operating systems but also for other platform elements as well. One approach is to compartmentalize services within the trusted operating system for individual customers. Let's summarize what we've talked about in this Chapter 10. We said that authentication credentials can be classified into three categories: what you know, what you have, and what you are. We said that passwords provide a very weak degree of security because they rely on human memory. And most password attacks today use offline cracking, where the attackers steal the encrypted password file. As an alternative to using passwords, we could use a token, which is a small device that generates a code from an algorithm once every 30 to 60 seconds, and then we enter that code. We said that biometrics can be based on authentication of what an individual has in terms of their standard features, their behavioral features, or cognitive biometrics. Single sign-on allows a single username and password to gain access to all accounts. We mentioned that group policy settings allow administrators to set password restrictions for an entire group at one time. And trusted operating systems are being redesigned from the ground up to give strong security built in. There we have it for Authentication and Account Management, Chapter 10, Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition.